Hi everyone, thanks for having me. We're just gonna dive right in. So for today's section, we're gonna talk about seeing mental health as more than just the absence of mental health difficulties. And in a second, I'll explain what I mean by that. But to begin, let's just start with when we hear the word health, what comes to mind? And I'm sure for most of us, what we think about instantly is how our bodies are functioning and functioning well enough to be able to do the things that we want to do, and also not having any illnesses or sickness. But when we think a bit more about that word health, we begin to realize that there's more to health than just that. So health also includes what we put into our bodies, what we eat. Health also includes how we move our bodies, how we exercise. Health also includes how we deal with stresses and challenges, and how our body fights off diseases and sicknesses when they show up. And these things I'm identifying are health behaviors. And we also know that there is no health without mental health. But there's a lot of information out there about things that we can do for our physical health, our health behaviors, to make sure that we're maintaining health, a good lifestyle. And so I want us to talk a bit about what health behaviors for mental health look like. What would that look like for you? And it's important to talk about this because when we say mental health, what might come up for people is depression, anxiety, trauma, and those things are really important. But we know that even when you're not experiencing those difficulties, mental health is still important because stress is an everyday part of life. So here are some health behaviors that can help with our mental health. And actually, before I go into that, let me just explain what I mean by mental health. When I say the word mental health, what I'm talking about is the current state of how we're thinking, how we're feeling, how we're acting, and how those things influence our ability to build and make relationships, to seek out and achieve goals and things that are important to us, how we are able to deal with challenges that may arise, and also how we're able to kind of work out and carry out our social roles, whether it's being a father or a friend or an employee or an employer. So mental health looks at how our thoughts, our emotions, and our behaviors influence every part of our lives. So the first tip I want to share is one about the power of noticing. And this is really important because in our everyday lives, we're all really used to going at things on autopilot mode. So what I mean by that is, for example, how many of you can remember what it felt like to brush your teeth this morning? Or how many of you can remember when you went to work, what was around you on your way there? Or how many of you, when you're reading a book, you get to some part of the book and then you realize, what was I just reading? Then you have to go back. All of these things are signs of being on autopilot. And autopilot can be helpful because it allows us to do things quicker and more efficiently. But some of the downsides of autopilot is that it also quiets down really important details that can be helpful to help us make decisions. And so, for example, one of the things that autopilot might do is when we're hungry, we might not realize that we're hungry until we get all these really loud signals that say you need to eat. Like you start getting a headache, your tummy starts making really loud noises, you get snappy with people around you. And that's one of the downsides of autopilot, which is we don't pick up on the little cues that our body is giving us, and we wait till it's the extreme where it has to get our attention before we act. And so being able to start checking in with ourselves is a really important mental health behavior that can support us. And I want to share with you, and actually if you're happy to do this, I want to invite you to do just an exercise with me. And what this exercise is to help support us to be a bit more present in our days, to notice what's going on for us as we're going through our day so that we can become more used to responding to things as opposed to reacting when things are a lot bigger. So if you're ready to do that with me, just get into a comfortable position. I have my laptop here, so I'm just going to guide you through that. And the good thing about this exercise is called Take 10 Breaths. You can do it anywhere. You can do it sitting in your office. You can do it in your house, in your living room. You can do it anywhere you are. So what I just want you to do is get into a comfortable position and just pause for a moment. I'm going to bring my laptop closer so I can look at you as I'm doing this. Okay. And actually make sure there's no distraction around you as we are doing this exercise. So pause for a moment and just take 10 slow, deep breaths. And just focus on your breathing out as slowly as possible. So when you breathe out, just focus on what that feels like until the lungs are completely empty, and breathe in using your diaphragm. So your diaphragm is that part of your body that moves up and down as you breathe. So just notice the sensations of your lungs emptying and your rib cage falling as you breathe out. And as you're doing this, notice what thoughts are passing through your mind. You might be thinking, oh, this feels quite weird. Or you might be thinking, what am I going to do after this Emerge conference? What am I going to eat? If you notice yourself having those thoughts, just notice they're there and come right back to your breathing. And now notice what you're feeling as you're breathing in and out. And just see if you can observe your thoughts and your feelings like a curious scientist, not judging them in any way, just letting them come and show up and pass. Try not to change them or avoid them or hold on to them. Just notice, oh, I'm having a thought there, and go back to your breathing. And just focus on your breath as you breathe in and out. And when you're ready, we can stop. So if I was there with you in person, I would like to ask, how was that for you? And it's not uncommon that people will have a mixed reaction to that. But what people tend to notice is that just by slowing down and paying attention to their breath, they might begin to notice things that were there, but they hadn't picked up on before. And that's the power of noticing. It allows us to begin to pick up on other things going on for us to allow us to make an informed decision. So another tip I want to share with you is quite a quick one that you can use anytime, and that's the acronym STOP. So anytime you're going through your day and you notice that things are stirring up for you, maybe you're beginning to get a bit stressed out, or you're beginning to get a bit snappy, or you're finding it difficult to concentrate. And these are all important signs of mental health, but we tend to ignore it because we just keep going with our day. And what we're just trying to do here is, rather than ignoring them, just pay attention to them. And the reason for that is, even when we ignore them, what we know from research is that they still influence what we do and what we don't do. So what the acronym STOP is when you start noticing things are stirring up for you, you start by stopping. You can even physically just stop. And then the T is take a couple of deep breaths. And what that does is that it just helps to anchor you a bit and just to slow you down a bit. And then the O is just to observe what's going on for me. How am I feeling right now? What am I thinking? What am I noticing in my body? And once you've done that, the P is to proceed. So you can either proceed with what you were doing before, or you can decide to do something else. So again, this is just another tip that you can use during your day just to help you to become more aware of how you're feeling, how you're thinking, and what you can do about those things. And most of these tips are just to help you regulate your emotions and your thoughts. Another thing that can be really helpful when we're thinking about health behaviors in the context of mental health is to watch out for what I call thinking traps. So just as we can have automatic behaviors where we just do things without thinking about it, we also have automatic thoughts. And it can be really helpful sometimes because these automatic ways of thinking, they help us make sense of things quicker and to make decisions quicker. But again, as we just highlighted a couple of minutes ago, while quickness can be really great, it can also drown out other important information that we have. So some of the thinking traps that we might find ourselves getting involved in, one of them is called overgeneralizing. So when things are going on around us, we might start saying, oh, this thing always happens this way. Why don't things always go the way I want? And we start using more of those always, never, and those things are kind of conclusive. And it's important to notice those kinds of thinking traps because then they get in the way of us trying to do things differently, and sometimes it can lead to us feeling stuck. Another really common thinking trap is mind reading, whereby we think that we can hear the minds of others. And so we might say things like, I know that person is thinking this way about me, or that person is criticizing me, or that person doesn't like me, even without us having a conversation with that person. So we're quick to come into conclusions about people, and that can sometimes get in the way of building relationships or interacting with others. Another one to be really mindful of as well is all or nothing thinking. And so it's always either extreme. So either something goes really, really, really well, or it goes really, really, really bad. And there's never a middle point. So an example of that is, if you're good at your job, like let's say something happens at your job and you do something well, you're like, oh, I'm really, really good at that, and I'm great at this. And then maybe the next day something happens, your boss criticizes you, or a colleague says something that puts you down. And then we go straight to the extreme and say, I'm just not good at this job. I knew I could never do this job. I just don't have the skills. And we tend to alternate between things are really good, one extreme, or things are really bad. And actually we know from experience in life is that actually things are not always in the extremes, and there's always a middle point. Another thinking trap that we can fall into is fortune telling, which is before we even do something or have an experience, we've already concluded. So we might say, I already know that if I go for that party, I'm not going to enjoy myself. It's going to be boring. I'm not going to have anyone to talk to. And then based on that, we just don't go. But the thing about thoughts to remember is that thoughts are not facts, they're just opinions. So we can almost treat them as somebody just saying to us, oh, this is what I think. And it's always important that even when we have a thought about something, we test that out. And we test that out through experience. So even if our thought says, actually, I'm never really going to be good at that, or actually, I don't really want to go to the party, it's really helpful sometimes just to actually do it and then make your own decision. And lastly, another really helpful tip, if we're thinking about this as health behaviors, that can be helpful when we're thinking about our mental health, is to watch out for what we call happiness myths or happiness traps. And this was something that was put together by a really popular psychiatrist called Russ Harris. So I want to read them to you because I'm quite curious to hear if you've ever found yourself in these happiness traps and how that impacts how you deal with your emotions. So when you're feeling anxious, or when you're feeling sad, or when you're feeling low. So the first happiness myth is that happiness is the natural state of all human beings. So this idea that we are always supposed to be happy, and that when we're not happy, then there's something wrong. And actually, this is a myth, because what we know is that our emotions are constantly changing. So 1 second you might be happy, another second you might be upset because something has happened, another second you might be anxious. So what we actually know about emotions is that they're constantly changing. And happiness is not one state that is supposed to be natural for all human beings. Another happiness trap that we might find ourselves kind of getting into is that if you're not happy, then you're defective. So this idea that when we're not happy, then there's something wrong with us, or we're not doing something right. And actually we know that's not true, because if happiness is not the normal state of every human being, we know that our emotions will constantly fluctuate. And emotions can be really helpful, and what we say about them is that they're messengers. So emotions bring messages to us to help us understand what's going on around us better, and understand what's happening with people, how we're communicating. So even not so good emotions are helpful, because they're helping us get a sense of how we're making sense of things. And as I was saying that, what came to my mind is, don't shoot the messenger. And we tend to do that when it comes to emotions. So when anxiety comes up and is trying to tell us that there's something in this environment that's making us feel threatened or in danger, we tend to shoot the messenger and we start struggling with anxiety, when actually what it's doing is trying to give us a message so that we can then act accordingly. So when we're not happy, this idea that it means that we're defective is actually a myth, and it's not the experience of all of us as humans. Another myth that we might tend to kind of find ourselves getting trapped in is that to create a better life, we must get rid of all negative emotions. So what that means is that when we feel anxiety, for example, or sadness, we might feel that we need to get rid of it at all costs because it's not supposed to be there. But what we know from experience actually is that what creates a meaningful life is when we're doing things that matter to us. So if we think about parents who have children, they would tell you that while it's one of the most rewarding things that they've ever experienced, it can also be the most exhausting, frustrating thing as well. So actually we know that meaning in life is not about not having emotions, and it's actually a combination of both striving for things that are important to us and difficult emotions that come as well with that. And lastly, another myth that we might tend to get trapped in is that you should be able to control how you think and feel. And this is a really common one. So when we notice ourselves having really difficult thoughts, we might try our best to try to avoid it, distract it, to get away from it. And the same for emotions. And one of the things I commonly say is that when we do that, we get into a struggle. So when we had just anxiety to begin with, when we start struggling with anxiety, we start getting anxious about our anxiety, angry about our anxiety, because we're like, I don't want you to be here, frustrated about anxiety, and it becomes bigger and bigger and bigger. So one thing that started off as anxiety then becomes anxiety, frustration, anger, sadness, and we have so much more that we're dealing with. And so rather than trying to control our thoughts and feelings, what can be more helpful is to start thinking about, how can I deal with that? How can I respond to this thought when it shows up? How can I respond to this feeling when it shows up? And some of the skills that we've talked about already, so the power of noticing, practicing the acronym STOP, and also noticing those thinking traps that might show up, and remembering that just because I think something doesn't make it a fact can be really helpful to remember. And again, remember with emotions are messengers. So don't shoot the emotion. Just ask yourself, what is the message that this emotion is trying to share with me right now? I hope that's helpful, and if you do practice these skills, I would love to hear how you're finding them. So if you want to DM me on Instagram and let me know, I tried that skill and it worked, or actually it didn't work. And I think something else to remember about these skills is to make it your own. So you might try stop and realize, okay, when I do it, I notice that if I proceed in the moment, it doesn't have the same impact as if I take a break and I step away for a couple of minutes. And that's really good information to have. And you can only know that from noticing how you're finding things as you're doing them. So make these skills and strategies your own, tweak them as much as you can, and practice, practice, practice. Because things that we do on automatic pilot, we do that because they're habits. So when we try to introduce new skills, we're fighting against habits that are already there. So one thing that can help us with that is practice, practice, practice. I hope you found that helpful, and bye for now. Thank you. So the question that has been asked is, when I feel overwhelmed, is it a good strategy to keep my mind busy just to get away from that feeling of being overwhelmed? Now, the important thing to remember is that there is no right or wrong way of being with our emotions and our thoughts. And it's really about what works for me. So when you try to distract yourself from feeling overwhelmed, does that work? And what I mean by that is, does that help you in that moment to feel like you're able to regulate that feeling of emotion? Or do you feel that when you're taking your mind away from it, it's almost like a constant struggle? So a metaphor that can be helpful is, think about a beach ball. If you try to push a beach ball underwater because you don't want that beach ball to come up, you'll probably have to stand there constantly to make sure it's there, because once you step away from it, what will happen is it will come right back up. So if the strategies you're using is almost like standing in the ocean with a beach ball, where you're not able to do anything else but just distract yourself because you feel that the moment you do, everything is going to come back up, that might probably be an indication that that's not working, because then it's getting in the way of you living life and getting in the way of you doing other things that are meaningful to you. So another strategy that might be helpful, so if that's working, because distraction can be a good strategy, which is what you're doing, but if you're finding that that's not helpful, because what happens is that then you do that for a couple of minutes and then it comes back again and then you have to do it again. So literally all you're doing is spending your time constantly having to distract yourself. Another strategy that might be helpful goes back to what I said about seeing or being overwhelmed as a messenger. So making room for that by asking yourself, okay, I'm feeling overwhelmed. First of all, what does that feel like for me? Where do I feel that in my body? Do I feel kind of heaviness in my chest? Do I feel really tired? Do I get a headache when I'm overwhelmed? What does that feel like in my body? And then once you notice that, try to track it. Where is this coming from? Am I overwhelmed because there's a deadline that's coming up for me and I feel that I have so much I'm having to deal with? Am I overwhelmed because there are issues going on in important relationships in my life, and that's where the feeling of being overwhelmed is coming from? And those things might be simple, but what they do is that they bring understanding to that situation. And when there's understanding, there's compassion. And when there's compassion, we're no longer trying so hard to fight away from it, but now we're turning towards it. And once we're able to identify what is giving us that sense of being overwhelmed, then we have two things we can do. One is there anything I can do about it? So if it's the deadline that's causing me to be overwhelmed, what can I do about this deadline? Can I plan? Can I come up with an action plan of things I'm going to do? Or is there other people around me that I can get involved to help me with that? Or is it rest? Have I just not had some time to rest? Do I need to rest a bit? So sometimes tracking can help us get a sense of direction of what we can do to help us manage and deal with that sense of being overwhelmed. And if there isn't anything in particular that has led to us feeling overwhelmed, and so there's no kind of problem solving skill we can do, I think the best thing that comes to mind is the Serenity Prayer, and I hope I can remember it. It says, Lord, help me to challenge the things I can and help me to accept the things I cannot. And that's really important, because sometimes we have to ask ourselves, is there something I can do to control this? And if there isn't anything I can do to control things, how can I just step back? Because the thing about emotions, if we go back to what we said, is that emotions are constantly changing. So one moment we might feel overwhelmed, the next moment we might feel anxious. And most times what maintains those emotions is when we try to struggle with them. So in our good intention to get rid of them, we keep them going. So sometimes what we might just need to do is step back and make room for that. And even the exercise we did of the 10 breathing is one of the ways that we can do that, where we slow down, we do a couple of deep breathing exercise, and we just notice what's going on for us without trying to get rid of it or change that. I hope that answers your question. Yeah, so I think the first thing to say about handling a bad breakup is that it sucks. We have to just acknowledge that breakups are tough, because when you're in a relationship, you spend time with that person, you form a bond with that person, and actually when we form those bonds, I'm actually reading a book called Attached. So it's a good book for people to read if you're interested in relationships. But when we form bonds, what we know is that it's not just emotional, but it's also cognitive. So there's a part of our brains that all it does is to try to help us build and maintain relationships. And we call that our attached systems. So when we have spent time with someone and we love them and we've gotten to know them, and then they break it off, it's almost like chaos up there because we're used to that. And that can often lead to protest behaviors. So protest behaviors are everything that we try to do to regain that relationship again because it was so important to us. So the first thing I want to say is you will feel sad. You will have protest behaviors where you're thinking about the person, wanting to call them, wanting to reestablish that relationship again, and that is okay. That's a biological, natural reaction to breaking off something that was quite important to you. So you having those feelings are normal. And I think the most important thing to remember when you're going through these times is you need support. You need people around you that you can talk to, that can be there for you, to support you. And some people appreciate closure. So if you feel that the relationship was kind of broken off abruptly and you're not quite sure what led to that or what happened, take some time out, because the thing about it is when we try to dive in right after the breakup to get closure, what we end up doing is we end up just trying to get that relationship back again, because in the moment it's still fresh, so we're still using all our protest behaviors. So take a couple of days just to sit back and think about the relationship. So your partner might be saying, this was what it was like for me, and just think, what was it like for me? Did I ever pick up on those cues that my partner was saying, or was it just things that I didn't notice? Because when you have that period of reflection, what that can bring is insight. So that when you try to go back and get closure, if that's what's helpful to you, then it can be a boundaried and structured conversation where you're talking more about the relationship, things that the partner picked up that you didn't pick up, and you also get a space to express how you're feeling. I think one of the things to remember about a bad breakup is about riding the wave. So if you've ever been to the beach, when there's a wave, it comes really, 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 really high and then it crashes. But that whole idea of when it's going high and crashing, it can be really difficult because we're dealing with so much emotions. But a bad breakup can be riding a wave. So we just kind of have to sit with that. And eventually what happens to a wave, it comes right back down. And that's something to remember. So it's natural to feel that way. You're going to have process behaviors where you're going to try to reconnect with your partner. You might call them, you might text them, you might stalk them on Instagram. Those things are natural, especially if that relationship was important to you. Take a bit of time to reflect on the relationship. Were there things I missed? Were there flags I missed that might have let me know that actually this wasn't working? Because reflection brings insight. And then ask yourself, do I need closure? And if I do, what exactly do I need to help me close this relationship? Because that will help you have a boundaried and structured conversation with your ex-partner that's meaningful for both of you, as opposed to it becoming a blaming game. And lastly, remember, ride the wave. It's really tough at the beginning, but it gets better with time. So how do I effectively manage my emotions after losing a loved one? I think the first thing that really strikes me with that question is the word effectively. Losing a loved one can be a life-changing experience, and there is no effective way of going through grief, because grief can turn our world upside down, and we're literally just trying to survive. We're literally just trying to keep our heads above water. And so it's important to acknowledge that and recognize that there is no right way or wrong way of dealing with grief. And something I always say is that if we know that emotions are messengers, the presence of grief signifies the importance of that relationship to you. So let yourself grieve, because by doing that, what you're doing is you're acknowledging that you have lost something that was really important to you. And that's important. I think another thing that can be helpful with grief, and actually, funny enough, I heard this from my dad, who's a pastor, but it's also kind of based in psychological research, is to ask yourself, if that person was here today, how would they want me to keep living? How would they want me to be? What would they want to see me doing if they were here? Because sometimes when we don't have the capacity to think for ourselves because we're dealing with a lot of grief, having that image of the person that we love that has passed away and how they would want us to live our life or to continue living can give us direction and steps of what to do to start kind of regaining a bit of normalcy back into our lives. And I think, there's the stages of grief, which is quite a common way of looking at grief, which is that when you go through grief, you will have a moment of denial where you just are, I cannot accept that this has happened, and that's normal. You have a period of anger. You might think, why did this happen? And sometimes you might direct that anger to God. And that happens sometimes, and that is the process of grief. And I think something I always say, especially when we have emotions and we direct it to God, is that God's love is so huge and so big that it can withstand even when you have a moment of anger with God. And it's important that during those times you take that to God and you let Him fill you with peace and comfort. And then also you get through a process of acceptance. And acceptance can look very differently for different people. Acceptance for some people might be thinking about ways that they can still incorporate that person into their lives, whether it's through having pictures around them, having a personal kind of belonging of that person, that they maybe their necklace, their ring. And it's really about finding ways that you can carry on living. And I think something that's important to remember is that carrying on living does not mean that you start forgetting the person or that you start ignoring that that person was in your life. And actually both of those things can coexist. You can carry on living and still acknowledge that this person was a part of your life and still find ways to incorporate whether memories that you had of them, experiences that you had together into your life as you keep going. But I think the main thing to remember is grief is complicated. There is no right or wrong way of dealing with it. And if you find that actually it's been a couple of months and you are struggling, that's okay as well. And it's okay to ask for help. Ask for professional help. There is such a thing as grief counseling, where you go see a counselor and you talk about the grief and you talk about how you're dealing with it. So if you think, actually, I can't deal with this on my own, it's okay to ask for help and ask for professional help. I hope that answers the question for you. So the question is about triggering events and how do you deal with that? And I think it's important to say that with triggering events, one of the things we know about our minds is that every experience we have, our minds, our memories are made up of the experience itself, the emotion that we felt at that moment when we're going through that experience, what we could see, what we could hear, what we could smell, and all those things make up a memory. And what we know about our minds as well is that the more traumatic a memory is, the easier it is for that thing to come back up in our memory anytime something happens that's even slightly related. So what I mean by that is a smell, a similar smell to the one that was when you had that triggering event can become the trigger for that memory to come back again. A similar sound can become the trigger, or a similar experience can become the trigger. And something even more recently, crisis. So going through crisis like COVID can become a trigger where things that you felt that you had initially sorted and dealt with and moved on with starts coming back up again. And that's quite normal because we know that when we're going through threatening or dangerous situations, we tend to regress. And so one of the main things to remember about triggering events is that it is a recollection of past experiences. So the first thing to do when you're feeling triggered is what we call grounding techniques. And what grounding techniques are things that you can do in the moment just to reorient your mind, to get your mind to remember what I'm experiencing happened in the past and it's not happening now. And so grounding exercises are anything that you can do with your senses. So whether it is what you can smell, what you can hear, what you can feel. And that's because you can only do those things in the present. So a good grounding technique might be pushing your feet on the floor, pushing your fingers together. It might even be things like getting smells that are calming. Some people use lavender, things like that. It might even be the music that you're hearing. It could even be doing a deep breathing exercise, and that's because our breath is an anchor. You can only breathe in the present. You can't breathe in the past. And so when you start with a grounding exercise, things like that, so pushing your feet on the floor, moving your shoulders, what you can smell. And another really good grounding technique is called noticing 5 things. Notice 5 things you can see, notice 4 things you can hear, notice 3 things that you can feel on your body, whether it's your clothes on your body, the wind on your skin, and notice 2 things that you can smell. Again, that's reorienting you to the present. Once you've done that grounding technique, that's the very first thing to do because it's almost like telling your brain, stop. Yeah? Once you've done that grounding technique, something else that can be really helpful is to remind yourself that happened then, that's not happening now, and I am safe. Even those words alone, what you're doing is you're sending feedback messages back to your brain because at the moment your brain is on alert. You have activated, so memories activate our stress system. So we go into fight or flight. So that's when adrenaline starts kicking in, our hearts start beating really fast, we start sweating. So even just saying things like, that happened then, that didn't happen now, and I'm safe. Those things can be really helpful when you're experiencing a triggering event. But something to say, if you're noticing that you're reliving stories a lot more than you would like, so stories that wake you up at night because you're having nightmares and you find that you're hypervigilant all the time. So hypervigilant is that you're constantly looking in your environment for threats, for anything that can remind you of that trigger, and you notice that you avoid anything at all that reminds you of those memories. That might be an indicator that it's time to see someone professionally because you might be going through what we call post-traumatic stress. And what post-traumatic stress is the stress you feel after a trauma. yeah, that starts impacting your functioning. So if you notice that you're reliving those experiences a lot more than you would like, it's impacting on sleep because you're having nightmares, you're often hypervigilant or restless, looking out for triggers, and lastly, you're avoiding anything at all that reminds you of that and is getting in the way of just living life, meeting with friends, going to work, that might be an indicator that you might need a bit more support. And that might be a sense of, okay, let me go see someone professional to help me with this. I hope that's helpful. The question is, if you've experienced a traumatic event, whether through abuse, sexual abuse, physical abuse, domestic abuse, and then you're out of that, so that abuse has ended, but now you find that that experience, you carry it with you into new relationships, and you're finding it difficult to relate in that relationship without that kind of frame of abuse. How do you deal with that? I think something to say is some of these questions, remember that there is no one quick answer to it, because most times abuse happens over a period of time, and therefore healing happens over a period of time. So there is no kind of do this, do that, and you would be fine. But one thing I just want to share, maybe to help you understand a bit better around why that happens, is the term called survival behaviors or survival positions, which is something I talk about on my side tips page, which is when we have been through abuse, we develop survival behaviors to allow us to get through that time, which in the context of that situation, it makes a lot of sense because it helps us to survive. Because one thing you have to remember about the brain will always prioritize survival over happiness or meaningful experiences or valuable things. So whatever you need to do to survive, even if it might be an unhelpful or toxic way of surviving outside of that context, that is what we will do when we are in a context of danger or threat. But what then tends to happen is that when we get out of that context, our survival behaviors follow up with us in those different situations, and they don't get updated. So even though we're now in a new relationship or environment, that doesn't require us to use those survival positions, because that's all we know and that has become a habit. That is what we naturally go to. And that is another example of what we call an automatic reaction or automatic response. I wouldn't say here, I'm really careful, because I think for people who are really struggling with that, where, for example, with sexual abuse, where you find that because of the way that you were raped, then your frame of intimacy and being sexual is one that is violent, that is something I believe you should go into counseling for. And it should not be a quick answer, this is what I do. But like we've always said, with automatic pilot, the best way to break a cycle is to look at that thing. We have to slow it down, because whatever you are paying attention to can't be done automatic pilot. So when we're talking about abuse or we're talking about sexual experiences, for example, it's important that we start trying to identify what are the triggers. So what is it about, for example, when my partner touches me, or for example, when somebody tries to get close to me, if you were abused, that makes me triggered? And what does my triggered experience look like? What do I feel in my body? What do I think in that moment? How do I feel emotionally? Because you have to remember, our behaviors are not an island in itself. We don't just react. There are things that come before that. There are thoughts that come before that. There are emotions that come before that. There are sensations that come before that. So a beginning step is to start trying to pay attention to what is it that happens before I push people away when they try to get close, if I was in an abusive relationship? What is it that happens before I push my partner away when he's trying to be intimate with me sexually? What is going on there? And that is always a starting point, noticing what are my triggers and what does that look like for me. But I would please encourage, if you are finding that these things are getting in the way of relationships, intimacy, closeness, healing takes time. It's important that you seek help, seek a counselor, and spend a bit of time talking about that, because one of the other dangers is if you remove a survival position and you don't replace it with something else, that as well can be extremely damaging. So it's important that we don't kind of just dive into stop doing this and not replacing it with something else. And it might take time to start adapting more helpful ways and more helpful habits of how to relate to closeness, intimacy, or ways that trauma might show up in our lives presently. So I hope that answers your question. So the question is about how do I deal with work politics when my boss isn't giving me the chance to prove myself and I don't want to be manipulative. What do I do? And what I'm just thinking is I probably need a bit more context, because what I'm hearing is really about a work dynamic between someone that's a bit more dominant, and it makes it difficult for the other person to express themselves. So their dominance silences the next person. And so it's important to get a bit more context around that. But what might be important is thinking about, how do I become a bit more assertive? How do I express my need in a way that I can be heard, but it doesn't rupture the relationship? And the truth of the matter is that sometimes it might be difficult to have, what I'm thinking, eat your cake and have it. So it's important to be able to express your need, but doing it knowing that you're taking a risk whereby the other person might not react the way that you want, because the only thing that we can ever control is our behaviors. We can never do anything to certainly say that if I do this, then this person will act this way, because we have no control over anybody else's behavior. So I think the question to that is, what is getting in the way of you expressing yourself? Are you worried that if you express yourself, your boss might criticize you, shout on you, you might lose your job? What is the blocker that makes it hard when your boss is being dominant for you to express yourself? First, name that. The second thing to remember is that being able to assert yourself is, one, first identifying what is it exactly I want to say, what is my need. Once you're able to identify the need, what you want to say, the next thing is, how do I communicate that with my boss? And there are a lot of things that impact effective communication. One is around timing. When is the best time to bring this up? Two is about, what would I need in that? Is it a conversation I can have with my boss on my own? Do I need to get other people involved? It might not necessarily be to get them involved in the conversation, but other people that have other perspectives and insights about your boss or about your dynamic that might be able to offer insight for you in terms of how to bring that up with your boss. And lastly, when you're communicating, what's important to say is, one, to identify what the need is. I think another thing to say that's really important is plan ahead. So you let your boss know, I want to have a conversation with you. When is the best time? So in other words, you're working with your time and your boss's time. Once you're able to plan ahead, the next thing is, when you're having that conversation, communicate why you're bringing it up, what the need is, and you also suggest a way of going about it. Because sometimes what tends to happen is, when we have a problem, we present the problem, but we do not present a solution. And then we create room for other people to suggest what the solution will be, which might not be what would meet our needs. So when we're trying to have sensitive conversations, it's important to be able to identify what your need is. What is the problem? How would you like it to be different? What would need to happen to make that thing be different? So that when you're having a conversation with your boss, you're having a well thought out of, this is the problem, but this is also my suggestion of what the solution would be. That way, there's a higher chance that you're more likely to get your need met. But again, it's important to remember that when we are assertive, it always comes with the risk that the other person might not respond the way we want. And then we have to think, what is more important to me? Is it more important to me to get my needs met? Or is it more important to me to keep my job? Or is it more important to me? So you have to identify what the importance is, and that should be what would guide you. But assertiveness in jobs, in relationships. They are so important because that is how we build boundaries. And without boundaries, that creates room for resentment and anger and frustration. So assertiveness is a great skill to have. And something I'll say about assertiveness, it's okay to practice what you're going to say before you say it, because especially with sensitive conversations, they also tend to be high pressured, and when we're in a high pressure situation, we find it more difficult to think straight, to pay attention, and to concentrate. So if you need to practice and come up with a script of what you want to say before you say it, that is completely okay. I hope that answers your question. So the question is about what do you do if you've set boundaries and you're in a relationship and the person keeps breaking it? How do you handle that? So I think the first thing to say is if you have been clear about your boundaries and somebody constantly breaks that, that is telling in and of itself about how much the person regards you and how much the person respects you. So what my question to you is, what's keeping you in that relationship if that person is constantly breaking your boundaries? And that's a really important question, because even as we get closer to people, it's really important that we have boundaries because of what we've just said before. When we don't have boundaries, that can breed room for resentment, that can lead to arguments, that can lead to anger. So boundaries are really important. And another thing about boundaries to remember is that setting boundaries is also about being vulnerable, because when we set boundaries and people cross it, do we have the ability to say, I'm not going to take that? And that can be a difficult thing to say because we always worry about losing the relationship. And the question then becomes, what's more important to you? Having somebody that respects and holds you in high regard, or just having a relationship? And if your answer is just having a relationship, then we have to think a bit deeper, because then we might be looking at things around what's keeping you in a relationship if that relationship isn't serving you. Because remember, relationship is about give and take. If you're constantly giving, and there is no compromise, remember that this is setting the tone for a lifetime with that person. So you're setting a tone for a lifetime of resentment, you're setting a tone for a lifetime of anger, you're setting a tone of a lifetime of frustration. So my question to you is, if somebody is constantly breaking your boundaries and you've communicated that with that person and they continue to do that, what is keeping you in that relationship still? And is it fear of losing that relationship that's still keeping you there? So we're asking a lot of questions and things that I put on side tip, and I'm really kind of tempted to say, go check out my side tips because we will answer a lot of these questions. But just to say, one of my posts, I define self-esteem as being aware of our flaws and still holding ourselves in positive regard, even with that flaw. And so with self-esteem, I think the importance of building our self-esteem is really about putting ourselves in situations where we can be authentic, be ourselves, be open, and still have positions of people accepting us, loving us, and us accepting ourselves. So the best way to build self-esteem, I think one is gradedly putting ourselves in a position where we can build our confidence. So what is tied to that self-esteem? Am I worried about the way that people might see me? Am I worried that if people know who I am, they won't accept me, they won't love me? What are the things that are tied to self-esteem? It's kind of going back to what we're saying about our thoughts. We often have ideas about how we hold ourselves. And rather than testing those things out, we take those ideas as fact, we stick to them, and we build walls that don't allow us to test that. And it's the same thing with self-esteem. So if we have ideas of how we view ourselves, how people view me, it's important that we test those things out. So doing things with that worry about, okay, if I do this, this person's not going to accept me. If I do this, this person is going to reject me. And doing it with those feelings and seeing what that's about. The best way to build self-esteem is putting ourselves out there, stepping out of our comfort zone and learning from that. With anything, actually, if you think about building confidence, the best way to build confidence is to do that thing and to keep doing it over time. And it's the same thing with self-esteem. So think about, what is it that makes me feel low in myself? What is it about my flaws that when I notice those flaws, I feel that I can't hold myself in positive regard? Is it in the way that I relate with others? Is it in my job? Is it in if you're in school? Is it with uni? Being in groups, talking in public situations? Try to identify, what is it about myself that I try to cover and hold, because I feel that if people see this, they're not going to hold me in positive regard, and that's why I don't hold myself in positive regard. And come up with what I call a graded plan. Start with something small. So if part of the reason why I have low self-esteem is because I feel that if people knew about, I'm just going to talk about something vulnerable. If people know that in my past I was adopted, I've just come up with a random thing. And this is a flaw about myself that I feel that if people know this, they might not accept me, or they might feel a certain way about me. So rather than having any kind of relationship, what I do is I just push people away and I kind of stay with myself. It might be about come up with a graded plan. So thinking about, okay, how can I start? Can I go out to settings or group settings where I'm around people? How do I feel when I do that? And then taking it one step, can I build a relationship with somebody else? With somebody? How is that for me when I build that relationship? How do I feel? What thoughts are showing up for me when I'm building that relationship? What emotions are showing up for me when I'm building that relationship? Are they getting in the way? Are they blockers? Building that up. Once you then have a trusted relationship, what is it like to start disclosing things about myself that I myself am ashamed of, or I myself feel that actually this thing makes me feel that I can't connect with others? Start with something small, test it out, and continue to build it. The best way to build self-esteem is to put ourselves in situations that we feel that we are not worthy of, that we're not supposed to be doing, and slowly testing that out. And that's the best way. I hope that answers that question. I talked a bit much in that one, but hopefully you get the point of that. So this is a really difficult question to ask, because this is where the line between my faith and my profession, they don't really agree on this. So we're talking about sex. So how you identify, do you identify as a man? Do you identify as a female? Do you identify as a transgender? And how do you relate to that? I think the best way to go about that is from a psychological point of view, there is no psychological explanation to that. What we say from a psychological point of view is that people are allowed to pick their genders and their sex and how they identify, and to live that. So it's not really a psychological issue. So there's nothing in terms of things to do, because then if you're thinking about it as a psychological problem, then you're going into a danger zone of asking the question, what do you do not to be a transgender? Which is not something that we would say in psychology. In psychology, everyone's allowed to identify as sex that they want to be. From a Christian perspective, that's another aspect, because then it becomes, what do you do about if I'm going through that and it doesn't fit in with my faith? Or if I know someone who's a transgender or cis female, cis man, and it doesn't fit in with my faith, how do you handle that? And I think the most important thing to remember is that the Bible says that one of our main callings, in addition to loving ourselves, is to loving our neighbors. And I think one of the things that we tend to do is that when things do not fit in with our faith, we can become quite critical and judgmental. And what that does is the opposite of what we want to do, which is it pushes people away. And our jobs as Christians is to bring people closer to God. And the Bible says that when you bring people closer to God and they have a space to develop a relationship with God, the Holy Spirit himself does the job. He does the working, he does the transforming, he does the renewing. And our job is to bring people to God. So the question of what do, you don't do anything, because your role as a Christian is to love people. So there's nothing you're supposed to do to try to advise people not to be a gender that they are or a sex that they are. And I think one thing to remember is that love does not mean agreement. You can love somebody and disagree with their lifestyle. And those two things can coexist at the same time. And I fear that sometimes as Christians, we feel that we are incapable of loving people because we think that if we love them, we are agreeing to their lifestyle. But those two things do not coexist. I hope that answers your question. So with masturbation and pornography, I'm just going to say, because while I'm a clinical psychologist, psychology is huge. And so there are some things that are my area of expertise, and there are some things that are not my area of expertise. And when it comes to sexual health, masturbation, and pornography, that is not my area of expertise. So I don't feel comfortable sharing with you tips because I don't want to mislead you. But there is a lot of information out there on ways to break addictions that you can research and you can look into. Again, sometimes I feel a bit limited here because I don't know a lot of resources in Nigeria of where you can go, but I believe that some of the websites in the UK are still things that you can access. And if you can, some starting points for things are go to mind.org, go to the official NHS, www.nhs.uk website, and they often have a lot of resources and links that you can look at if you have questions around addiction, whether it's drug addiction, sex, masturbation, pornography, and those are things that you want to work on. So those are always really good starting points. So that would be my answer on that. So if you noticed, a lot of the questions that came up today, while I offered some advice on what to do, one of the key themes that I kept saying was, if you find that you're struggling, seek help. Seek help. And the reason why I was saying that is because you have to remember, like we talked about health and then we went to our mental health. It's important that we treat our mental health the way that we take our physical health, just as seriously as we do. So we always say, if you are unwell and you don't have any things in your house, your medicine cabinet that can help you get better, what do? You go see your doctor, and it's fine to do that. And it's the same thing for our mental health. If you find that you are struggling and you're struggling with thoughts or emotions or trauma or abuse, and it's becoming overwhelming, you're not able to deal with it on your own. And not only is it becoming overwhelming, it's getting in the way of living, it's getting in the way of life. These are indications that it will probably be helpful to go seek some professional help. And like I always say, mental health, going to see a therapist, talking about it, these are recommended prescriptions. Just as like when you go to your doctor says, take this medication for a couple of days, or your doctor will say, you need to take an injection for this. It's the same thing with mental health. A lot of research has gone into talking therapy, and we know that when you're having difficulties with thoughts and emotions, talking therapy is one of the best prescriptions you can take to help you overcome that time. And another thing to say, like we discussed earlier on, mental health is more than just the absence of depression and anxiety. So sometimes one of the stigmas that show up with mental health is that if I go, then that means I'm crazy, or that means that there's something wrong with me, or that means I'm defective. But actually, it's the opposite of that. Because if you don't go, then what you're doing is you're prolonging difficulties that you can get help with. Why prolong something because you're worried that people might think about you a certain way, and in the long term, like we say, you start with one thing and by the end of it you're dealing with a pile of difficulties that you have to deal with. And I think if anybody can say this better than anybody, it's me, because I'm a clinical psychologist and I'm a pastor, and I found that it is possible for mental health and Christianity to coexist. God gives wisdom to the doctors. He also gives wisdom to the psychologist. So if we are worried about going, meaning that we don't have faith, or going meaning that we're not Christian enough, that is a thought. Notice the thought. Treat the thought as an opinion, not a fact. And take that step to go. And actually, if you go, what you're really doing is you're being courageous, because courage is doing something in the presence of fear, anxiety, difficult thoughts, difficult emotions, and still doing it anyway. The best way to grow is to step outside of our comfort zone. So if you're doing something and you don't feel comfortable, you're probably doing something right, because you've stepped out of that comfort zone. A comfort zone is there for a reason. It keeps you comfortable, but comfortability can also stifle growth, and comfortability can also stifle healing. The Bible has said that as Christians, you are healed. You're called to be healed. So do not let thoughts, do not let stigma, do not let fear of what will people say stop you from having the right that God has given you to be healed, not just in your physical body, but also in your mind, your emotions. So go, go, go. If you need the help, go seek it. So I hope that you have found this time together helpful. We started by talking about health, and we talked about how it's important for you to have health behaviors to maintain your health. And we've said that health without mental health is no health, because your mental health is a huge part of your overall health. We talked about different themes that can help us to maintain our mental health. And some of the most important ones is around the power of noticing what's going on around you. We also talked about thinking traps. We also talked about happiness myths. And in the question and answer time, we also touched on a number of different things. But this is only the beginning. If anything that we talked about piqued your interest, or you're curious about it, then do something about it. Go online, Google that word I talked about and read more about it, or send me a DM and say, I really like what you said about happiness myth. Where can I get more information about that? Or follow me on Psych Tips. I'm constantly sharing information about psychology, about thoughts, about emotions. Follow me on Psych Tips if you are interested in any of these things and you want to learn more about it. There's so much research out there. There's so much resources online. It's just about doing the steps and taking the steps to go online, Google, and start reading and start developing yourself. So I hope you've enjoyed this time together. Bye for now.